Hello. Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be in England. You know, I used to call England my home back in the early 2000s, and then you politely asked me to leave. But it's okay. It's no hard feelings. But back then, I was a retail architect. Maybe that's why you asked me to leave. I did a lot of shopping centers, some you may know, all over the UK, all over the world. I'm going to move. I hate the podium. And then I had three realizations. One was that I hate shopping malls. I don't like shopping. And then the third one that was both exciting and disturbing that I would like to share with you. Whoops, it's this one. That you have thoughts that lead to actions and what you say. But what really happens is a lot of the things that we believe, the things we think, actually literally become concrete and steel and glass and mud and bricks and mortar. That if there are communities we don't care about, that is reflected in the environment. If we believe in separation and punishment and vengeance, we create buildings and neighborhoods that actually mirror that. And there's a feedback loop that actually amplifies our thoughts over and over and over again. So I thought, if I'm an architect and my job is essentially to translate our thoughts and beliefs into built form, I should probably stop building shopping centers and start to use my craft to address big social problems, social justice issues, and I chose one. I chose one that was impacting me personally, my family, my friends, my community, my country, and it was this one: mass incarceration and our prison industrial complex. So Americans like to think we're number one in a lot of things, but there's one thing we're number one in, and that's in incarcerating our citizens. We have 7 million of us under carceral control, so that's prison, jail, probation, and parole. I just highlighted the UK just to show you really we're kicking your ass, that we were way, way better than you at that. And it was disturbing to me. What you may or may not know is that a disproportionate amount of those are men of color. They're in for nonviolent offenses. They have very low levels of education. They have very high levels of trauma. It's destroying their lives, their families' lives, the lives of their entire communities. It's a disaster. It's a disaster. And so I go to look at the architecture, and I see that the beliefs, the racist beliefs, the patriarchal and punitive beliefs are absolutely manifesting in the architecture. And I'll be really honest, I really didn't know what to do. I had no idea. And now here's my slide about light. So I was walking around last night, and I was really moved by what I saw. I was really particularly moved by my experience in the cathedral. And it reminded me that sometimes the brightest light is actually the light inside when you have an awakening, right? When you have that aha moment. I mean, maybe we've all had it. I had it when I first heard about restorative justice. Who knows what restorative justice is? Good, we got a nice, oh, thank God. People used to never raise their hand when I asked that question. So I thought, wow, here's a philosophy that says that when a crime has been committed, it is essentially a breach of relationship. That the primary focus should be on addressing the needs of the victim in the community. That whoever has committed the offense is accountable and should be able to make amends with the intent of repairing the relationship. I learned that it cost 1/8 of what it costs to put people in prison and jail. I learned that it worked. I learned that it was spreading all over my country and all over the world. And I thought, well, why aren't we designing for that system? This doesn't make any sense. These are truth and reconciliation courts, family group conferences, victim offender mediation, peacemaking circles. Like, why couldn't we begin to re-envision justice through that lens? So I just wanted to share with you our journey to doing that, our response to that. And I got very excited in the beginning. I was like, I'm going to make the first restorative justice center in the whole world. It's going to be awesome. And then I put my ego in the ego box, and I put that off to the side because I had really no idea. I was like, what does that look like? I'm like, I don't know what that looks like. And so I stopped my sketching. These were my early sketches. And I teamed up with a restorative justice expert of 20 years, one of our best, Dr. Barb Taves. And we started to ask some people who might actually be able to help us, people who had been both victims and offenders, people that nobody had ever talked to before. And we developed this toolkit for exploring the intersection of restorative justice and design, and started to run design studios with incarcerated men and women in prisons and jails all over the country. We taught them how to build models, how to do perspective drawing, all the tools that architects have, but in a way that we could do inside of an institution where there were high levels of security. And let me tell you, they had a lot to say about it. They had a lot to say. They also had a lot of amazing ideas. We were learning an incredible, incredible amount. They were creating healing sun centers, places where they felt they could be accountable for their actions, where they could heal, where they could meet and talk to their victim. This is the Restorative Justice Tree Center, which is actually an in-residence facility for both victims and offenders to have dialogue. Then something really weird started to happen. We were noticing that we hadn't built any buildings, but just the process of visualizing spaces of accountability, spaces for healing, that incarcerated people were actually starting to process trauma and emotion. I was watching it happen. And I realized that I had strayed a little bit outside of my architectural training here, and I decided to get some additional training. I became a peacemaker. I got circle keeper training. I drew on my own personal transformation work, which is another talk, but it was very helpful for me. And I started to run circles in lots of communities. I called it the Peacemaking Palette. And so I would invite people to tell a story about a space that nourished them, and it would also get me design input and start to train people in what that felt like as a cultural practice. Has anyone ever been in a peacemaking circle before? See, that's probably normal, right? I have, but I want everyone to be able to, because the hope is it's a shift in cultural practice. I also had people role play as victim and offender. What kind of spaces would you need and environments would you need to face the worst thing that you'd ever done? To face someone who harmed you at the deepest level? Could you? Where would you want to go for that? And so an architectural intervention was not a giant restorative justice center. It was just a little room that we did where I live in Oakland. It was a peacemaking room in East Oakland. And what it allowed us to do was actually create a set of design guidelines for creating restorative spaces and restorative programs in schools. So we could then create those design guidelines and deploy them to schools all over the country, trying to bring peacemaking into their schools as an alternative to suspensions and expulsions, which is what we knew was the cause of the school to prison pipeline. So after that, we scaled up to a building and to another community in Syracuse, New York, in the near west side. It's a very low-income neighborhood, very diverse neighborhood. And our partners for that was the Center for Court Innovation. We also won a federal grant. So we've spent $68 billion on the prison industrial complex, but we do reserve $10 million for innovation. And this is one of them. So the pilot is to bring Native American peacemaking practices for the first time into a non-Native community as an alternative to going to court. So while they were developing that program, we were using the peacemaking palette to adaptively reuse a crack house in the neighborhood that is now going to be the Peacemaking Center. So it is nearly done. Interiors are under construction. They are using metal chairs, but what's happening is that people are already coming to sign up for peacemaking as an alternative. They know where to go. It's in their community. And so I was getting excited. I was like, all right, we're making peacemaking centers. I started to talk to other people about peacemaking centers. I talked to a group in Uganda about making peacemaking centers. And then this happened. Ferguson, a community rising up against the police to say, please stop killing us. And so there was a different kind of light that got shown on the very deep structural racism that was happening in the United States, stemming back to slavery. And it was kind of an emergency. And I realized that peacemaking centers were not really going to be enough for us. And my phone started to ring more often. People were returning my calls now. And our new approach was actually to work within the criminal justice system. So we started to work with sheriff's departments. The PopUp Resource Village was a sort of rapid response prototype to this, where we were trying to address the lack of resources, the isolation, and the education gap that we were seeing in low-income communities and communities of color. So funded by the Rauschenberg Foundation, an arts organization, and Google, What we're doing is we're taking municipal buses and we're turning them into schools for the Sheriff's Charter School. We're turning them into women's shelters for women who are getting released in the middle of the night. Often what happens, women are released and the pimps are there waiting to take them back into prostitution, or the drug dealers are waiting there. This will scoop them up. We are also looking at other forms of mobile services. That's medical, fresh produce, daycare. We have barbers who are going to be coming. And the idea is that they will create a village that will travel from neighborhood to neighborhood, also creating some urban regeneration at those sites. You know, we believe, I keep showing these pictures of people doing stuff, but we really believe in deeply engaging the community. So we did a series of workshops with the funders, with the city, with formerly incarcerated folks and community leaders to figure out what should those resources be. What should the buses even look like? I love to give people glue guns and knives because they'll just go crazy. They'll just make stuff. And so they were making beautiful things. And so the first bus is scheduled to be built in January, and it's the School on Wheels. The students and the very people who the services are for are going to be also building out the bus as part of an employment training program. So we try and keep a triple bottom line in the projects of both being environmentally sustainable, socially sustainable, and economically sustainable. By the summer, we should have the women's shelter buses up and running and another school bus. And by the end of next year, we will have a prototype village that's moving between our neighborhoods and hopefully deploy that model to other cities. So also after Ferguson, we realized the small intervention is critical as the development of prototypes, but that we needed to start thinking at the scale of the city. And so we teamed with some futurists called the Institute for the Future, which are think tank. It's a think tank for future systems thinking. I had never heard of them. I just happened to run into them. And we were like, we want to end prisons. I'm like, so do I. So we started this project, and I don't know if you know this, but you have the first restorative justice city about 2 hours from here. It's Hull, England. Did anybody know that Hull, England was the world's first restorative justice city? Yay, they are. And so we're hoping we're number 2. We're trying to make Oakland number 2. And so we met with the city, and we met with the Oakland Police Department and some of our country's restorative justice leaders, and started to think, like, what would be the physical infrastructure we would need for that? Prison Fellowship International, if you know that organization, wrote a document called RJ City about what that would need to look like systemically. But no one had ever really thought about what the infrastructure might look like. And what we were finding was actually consistent with the other things we were learning. That often what we do with justice is we separate it off into a chunk somewhere. But what actually needs to happen is not just the re-envisioning of that, but a distribution of that across the city in a hyper-local condition and meld it into the ecosystem of the city. And so we created a series of action domains around multiple sectors of civil society and some examples of those. So one was being your best self, co-created social services that would empower people with dignity and respect. And an example of that are network opportunity centers, which we have coming out of New York, which takes both design and a cultural shift for people on probation, where it's a place where they can get resources so they can be successful and not recidivate. Hybridizing justice, big advocates often like, we don't need more prisons and jails, we need new types of architecture that support this. And one of them are reentry campuses or reentry centers. These are places where men and women can re-enter, they can live there, they get job training, they get education, trauma-informed care. I think if you don't have them already, you're going to, because can you see Richard Branson is hanging out at our reentry center? Is it Sir Richard Branson? I think it is. And then facilitating restorative dialogue. I believe that this is maybe the thing I'm most passionate about is the role that art plays in facilitating restorative dialogue in the restorative justice city, which I think would probably look the way the city looks today, the way Durham is looking today. And I think that is not just in the case of interpersonal violence that happens now, like the Philadelphia Mural Project, where victims and offenders are creating murals, but also in the case of mass social conflict and violence, like the Vietnam War Memorial or some of Christoph Radishko's work at Lumiere and Derry, where we're able to, in the public realm, to start to address the trauma. I don't know of any culture that isn't trying to address and deal with their own historical legacies of violence. And then for us to end, designing for impact. I got some great news yesterday that, remember my little sketches I was doing, that my partners and I have signed an agreement to both design and develop the very first Restorative Justice Center in Oakland. So we will begin that in January. Yay! Awesome. I would love it to be on the lake and be right near the courthouse to say, you know, this is what it should be. But my partners are amazing, and after 5 years, here's what we've learned. I can't remember who said earlier, it takes time to build these models. But we're going to be having both restorative justice for the entire county will happen here. We also call it a Center for Restorative Economics because we'll have a restaurant training low-wage restaurant workers to get high-end jobs. We'll be incubating food businesses there. We'll be working with Just Cause to create community-responsive housing where they'll grow their own food that will also supply the restaurant and a co-op at the bottom of the store where the food incubator folks can also sell their goods. And we will also have a great amount of community organizing space. So the idea is that this model of program in place, these new types of architecture, can begin to address and end mass incarceration. And so I'll leave you with this slide to conclude. This is my favorite quote by Cornel West, but I guess for me it means that if we can just change our beliefs and our thinking about what justice looks like and maybe view it through a lens that transformation is possible, I think that's where it really starts. Thank you.